So welcome everybody. My name is Tom Banshoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm delighted to welcome you to today's symposium on religion and U.S. immigration reform. It's a joint effort of the Berkeley Center, the Institute for the Study of International Migration, and the Woodstock Theological Center. We've got two great panels that my colleague Susan Martin from the Institute will be introducing. And I also want to point out Elżbieta Wojciak, who's really done the lion's share of the work in pulling together this very impressive set of panelists for this afternoon. Our topic, of course, is always topical: immigration reform. It moves up and down with the electoral cycle, but perhaps now in early 2011 is a great opportunity to sort of take stock and look forward and to reflect in particular on the role of religious communities around these questions. As you know, as we all know, there's a huge intersect between the ethical, the normative commitments of religious communities and issues of migration and immigration. And increasingly those normative concerns are finding expression in politics and policy in all kinds of interesting ways. So thank you all for coming, and with that I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Tom, and I'd like to thank the Berkeley Center and Woodstock Theological Center for their sponsorship with us at this meeting. It's actually the third in a series of meetings that we've had on religion and migration. The first two focused looking out and particularly at the role of migration in setting foreign policy, roles of diasporas, and how religion interplays with issues of migration. There is a report of the discussions in the first two meetings that are available on the Berkeley website and our own. But this one, we're turning a bit more inward, looking at the first session at the role of religion in the debates over immigration reform, and I'll be introducing the speakers in a minute on this. And then the second panel, and equally or perhaps in some ways even more important issue, and that's the role of religion in the integration of immigrants into their communities. And an issue that has been important historically within the United States and certainly important throughout the world as immigrants face many challenges in adjusting to their new countries, and certainly the communities in which they settle face challenges in incorporating immigrants into their midst. So we'll be looking at both immigration policy and the role of religion, but equally we'll be looking at immigrants and immigrant policy and the process of integration, the two sides of the immigration coin. We have a very distinguished panel to start us off on discussion of the role of religion and religious organizations in immigration reform. We'll be starting with Daniel Cox, who's the Director of Research and co-founder of Public Religion Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Prior to joining PRRI, is that true?
Yeah.
Mr. Cox served as a research associate at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, where he worked on a number of surveys, including the Religious Landscape Survey. For our purposes, probably the most important thing about his resume is that he has a master's in American government from Georgetown University. And so we welcome you back to campus. Thank you for joining us. I will introduce each of the speakers in turn and then just call on them to either speak from the table or the podium. I think we'll probably all go into the front row, though while we see some of the data that Dan will be presenting. But Richard Land, our next speaker, has served as president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission since 1988. He's a prolific author and also the host of a number of radio shows on faith and family. Until recently, he sat on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom.
Still do.
Still do.
At least last time I checked.
Okay, we made a mistake on that one. He has a bachelor's from Princeton and a D.Phil, Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. And he, in March 2007, he participated in a symposium on evangelicals and foreign policy, sponsored by the Berkeley Center, and also participated in our last symposium on religion and international migration. Next will be Kevin Appleby, who directs the Migration and Refugee Services Office of Migration and Refugee Policy in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he assists the bishops in the development and promotion of migration and refugee policy positions. He holds a law degree from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University, which we won't hold against him. He often speaks on immigration issues to local and national groups, and he's worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Russell Long and the Senate Select Committee on Iran-Contra. He brings great depth of experience. Our final speaker will be Melanie Nezer, who's a senior director for U.S. Programs and Advocacy for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. She directs their Washington, D.C. office and coordinates IS's Immigrant and Refugee Services Department. She has worked in a number of different capacities at HIAS, and before joining HIAS, she was the Immigration Policy Director for Immigration Refugee Services of what is now the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, where she also served as co-editor of Refugee Reports and a writer for the annual World Refugee Survey. She obtained her law degree from Boston College Law School and her undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So we do have a very distinguished panel. They'll each be speaking for 10, 15 minutes or so, a little bit longer for the presentation of some of the polling data. And then we do want to leave time for discussion with the audience, just looking around. I know there are quite a number of people who themselves have had a lot of experience in this area. So, Dan, would you like to begin?
We need to move.
I think so. We'll start. Melanie wants to see in
Great, really glad to be here. I want to say thanks to the Berkeley Center for inviting me, allowing me to share some of my research. Everyone can hear me all right? Okay. My name is Dan Cox. I'm with the Public Religion Research Institute. We are a nonprofit education research company that focuses on issues at the intersection of religion, values, and public life. And I'm here today to talk about some recent research we've done on immigration reform. Okay. Quick overview of the presentation. I'm going to go over real quickly my data sources, talk about the immigration system, what people really know about the immigration process, and what they think about the system. I'm going to look at immigration reform, both policy and the politics of it, look at attitudes toward immigrants, particularly their economic contribution to society, and then finish up talking about immigration, religion, and values, particularly what people are hearing in church, and the values that people think should guide immigration reform. So first, the data. The data for this presentation primarily comes from two sources: the Religion, Values, and Immigration Reform Survey, which also consisted of some focus groups we conducted in Columbus, Ohio, and also the American Values Survey, which is a biennial survey that we conducted last in 2010. Both were funded by the Ford Foundation. Additionally, I rely on some Pew Research Center data and a Gallup survey. Okay, the immigration system. So it turns out that Americans aren't all that informed about the immigration process in this country. Only 1 in 4 say they know a lot about how the process works. About half say they know some, and about 1/3 say they know not much or almost nothing. Yet despite not having a real good idea about how the process works, at least 6 in 10 Americans say that it is somewhat or very difficult for immigrants to come to the country legally. And interestingly, we actually looked at how much people know about the process and how difficult they thought it was to come to the country legally. And we see some interesting differences here. About 2/3 who say they know a lot about the process say it's actually very difficult for immigrants to come legally. Among those who know very little about the process, they're actually somewhat split, with about 46% saying it's somewhat difficult, and 43%, nearly equal number, saying it's not all that difficult. This is probably doesn't surprise a lot of people. Most Americans do not think the current immigration system is working all that well. 7% say it's generally working. About 1/3 say it's working, but with some major problems. Another third says it's broken, but working in some areas. And 1 in 5 Americans say the immigration system in the U.S. is completely broken. Now looking at the policy, comprehensive immigration reform, and also look at the DREAM Act, and look at the political salience of immigration reform, paying particular attention to the 2010 election. So overall, immigration ranked relatively low compared to most other issues, particularly the economy, which is, again, is not particularly surprising. We asked people what was the most important issue to your vote. 7% said immigration, ranked right about the same as social issues, same-sex marriage and abortion. However, although people didn't say it was the most important issue, we found that about half Americans said that they'd actually be more likely to vote for a candidate who did support comprehensive immigration reform. About 1 in 5 said they'd be less likely, and about 1/3 said the issue wouldn't make a difference to their vote. So although it wasn't the most important issue, it did matter for some. Okay, looking at immigration reform and federalism, we see that about 2/3 of Americans say that immigration reform should be decided at the federal level as opposed to being left up to the states. And we see some significant political differences here, with Democrats much more likely to support a federal solution, Republicans somewhat less, and the Tea Party are actually split on this issue, with about as many saying it should be decided by the states as saying it should be decided by the federal government. So we actually have 2 questions that we've asked on comprehensive immigration reform. We found, like healthcare, support for comprehensive immigration reform depends significantly on how it's defined. For instance, when you unpack what comprehensive immigration reform is and explain the details of the policy, it actually garners significantly more support. Here we offer a general description. So do you favor or oppose allowing undocumented immigrants who've been in the U.S. for several years to earn legal working status and an opportunity for citizenship in the future? This general question elicits about 60% support from the general public, 9% support from Latino Catholics, more than 6 in 10 among Black Protestants and unaffiliated, and majority support from white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. White evangelicals are generally split on this question. All right, so this gets a little confusing, but I'm going to walk you through it. So here we have the 2 different questions. The top question is the full description is when we broke out what comprehensive immigration reform actually was. So we define it as requiring all legal immigrants to register with the government, meet certain requirements, including working, paying taxes, learning English before having the opportunity to apply for citizenship. And asked in this way, we get 86% support for comprehensive immigration reform, including nearly 9 in 10, or about 9 in 10 among white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, and white evangelicals. So clearly, when you sort of define what is actually in comprehensive immigration reform, sort of like the healthcare policy, it becomes much more popular with the general public, including religious groups. So interestingly, the unaffiliated, we see that there's not a huge gap there, and among the unaffiliated Democrats and actually liberals as well, we see a much smaller increase, and we think this is probably because of some objections to what's actually in the policy, some of the requirements. Okay, looking at the DREAM Act, here we actually see somewhat less support than for comprehensive immigration reform. About 53% of the public says they would vote for allowing, and this is Gallup's wording, allowing illegal immigrants brought to the U.S. as children to gain legal status if they join the military or went to college. We see significant religious, generational, and political gaps here. The one that I'm going to start off at the top. A big difference between white Catholics and white Protestants, about 57% support among white Catholics, but only 37% among white Protestants. It's a 20-point gap. real big generation gap, which we actually see across immigration issues. So nearly 7 in 10 young adults, age 18 to 29, support the DREAM Act compared to only 43% of seniors. And finally, we see a huge 30-point gap among conservatives and liberals. Okay, so no more numbers for at least one slide. This is looking at our focus groups, and I really kind of wanted to bring this in to sort of focus on the division between Catholics and Protestants. So we conducted 4 focus groups in Columbus, Ohio in mid-2010 among white Protestant voters and white Catholic voters. And one of the things that really came out of that focus group was the division between these two groups. We asked, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word immigration? And among white Catholics, it evoked much more positive images and reactions than among our white Protestant groups. Among white Catholics, they really went to their own immigrant stories and members of their ethnic communities and those experiences, which were generally positive. The white mainland Protestant groups tended to look at sort of the more legal aspect of immigration, focus on illegal aliens, illegal immigrants who are sort of working under the table, which is sort of, so these two are sort of good examples of that difference. Okay, continuing with some attitudes about immigrants, we actually looked at what people thought about the economic contributions of illegal immigrants coming to the country today. So one of the most striking things here is we see there's actually not that much change over the last 10 years in attitudes about immigrants, which is actually kind of surprising. In 1999, 44% of the country said immigrants today are a burden because they take jobs, housing, and healthcare. And 46% said immigrants today strengthen the country because of their hardworking talents. Fast forward about 10 years, and the numbers have flipped, but they're still really close, with 48% saying immigrants are a burden, and 44% saying they strengthen the country. So not huge shifts going on this question. Looking at some religious divisions, these are really significant. When we look at our white Christian groups, we find the majority of white Catholics, white mainline Protestants, and white evangelicals saying that immigrants are a burden because they take jobs, housing, and healthcare. Black Protestants are somewhat interesting, and we see that half of them actually say that immigrants strengthen the country. And then we get majority support among the unaffiliated and high support among Hispanic Catholics, not surprisingly, 8 to 10. Lastly, I want to talk about immigration, religion, and values, looking at what people are hearing in church and what people think what values should serve as a guide to immigration reform policy. So this data comes from Pew. They found that about 1 in 4 Americans are hearing about the issue of immigration in church. Significantly less white mainland Protestants and white evangelicals. White Catholics, about the same as the general population. 3 in 10 black Protestants say they hear about the issue of immigration. And Hispanic Catholics, the majority say they're hearing from the clergy on this issue. In our immigration survey, we asked how comfortable people would be with their clergy speaking out in various venues. And there's actually a lot of, people are generally very comfortable with their clergy speaking out on this issue in most settings. We found, in fact, more than 7 in 10 said they'd be comfortable with their clergy speaking at a local community meeting, in the local media, or in an adult education session. But we found a majority said they'd be comfortable with their clergy speaking from the pulpit during worship service, which I thought was interesting. And we actually found there's not actually that much division between religious groups. So these general patterns appear across religious groups. Lastly, some guides and values that should serve as a guide to immigration reform. We asked people if we could choose between 7 different values and asked them to ask how important would these values be to you as a guide to immigration reform. And I really want you to focus on the top 4. At least 8 in 10 Americans said the top 4 values are important guides to immigration reform. And these include enforcing the rule of law, promoting national security, ensuring fairness to taxpayers, promoting the dignity of every person, and keeping families together. So there's sort of a consensus that these 4 values were all important as guides to immigration reform. Following the golden rule was somewhat less, about 7 in 10, and welcoming the stranger was just about 53%. So in conclusion, what we find in the polling is that Americans believe the immigration system is broken. Believe it should be up to the federal government to fix it. we find strong consensus about the values that should guide immigration reform. We also find that the majority of Americans favor a comprehensive approach to immigration reform, even as they are more divided about the contributions that immigrants are making to American society. And finally, we find that support for immigration reform increases when the policy is described in full, when the requirements are set forth in the policy. And with that, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We'll hold questions after all of the speakers. So, gentlemen, would you want to speak from here? Or?
I think I'll speak from here if that's all right. I think
Could you,
we can move the mic, but I'm sure they can hear me. God knew I was going to be a preacher before I did. I always wondered why the teacher could hear me when she couldn't hear the other students. There were two reasons. One, my voice carries, and second, I was usually talking. Thank you for that presentation. It confirmed most of what I intuitively felt about the immigration issue. I think that the American public in general is well ahead of its elected representatives on the issue of comprehensive immigration reform. They are ready for their elected representatives to behave like statesmen rather than politicians. Politicians being defined as people who worry about the next election, and statesmen, people who worry about the next generation. I think the raw materials, the pieces of a comprehensive immigration reform policy are already lying around waiting for public policy officials at the federal level to pick them up almost like a prefab house and put them together and present them to the American people. When it comes to evangelicals, I think the majority of evangelicals support comprehensive immigration reform. You notice that when what was defined as comprehensive immigration reform was explained to them, the more details they got, the higher the percentage went up. And the reason for that is that the people who are against comprehensive immigration reform have done an excellent job of trying to smear all of those who are for comprehensive immigration reform as being open borders, amnesty folks who want to let anybody in the world who wants to come to the United States come to the United States with no requirements, no penalties, no anything. And when you start explaining that comprehensive immigration reform involves registering and undergoing criminal background checks, penalties, and earning a pathway to legal status, and also involves securing the border, the percentage goes way up. I discovered this in my own working through this. I was very frustrated with the way this debate was going in the early years of this decade, and particularly frustrated with the way it played itself out in the McCain-Feingold and Bush efforts in 2005 and 2006. And so I began to construct a way of talking about this that I felt would appeal to Southern Baptists and other evangelicals, and have found that it has worked. That we're citizens of two kingdoms. We're citizens of heaven, and we have obligations as part of the kingdom of heaven to give a cup of cold water in Jesus' name, to welcome the stranger, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, to seek to house the homeless, to minister to those who are in need. We're also citizens of the United States, and Romans 13 tells us that God ordained the civil magistrate, and he ordained the civil magistrate to punish those who do evil and to reward those who do that which is good, and that we are to be subject to the civil magistrate for conscience sake. That means obeying the law. That means supporting the rule of law. And we have, unfortunately, an immigration system that's broken. It's broken because the federal government hasn't enforced the law for at least the last 26 years. I would argue that the last president of the United States who seriously sought to enforce immigration laws was Dwight Eisenhower. But for at least the last 26 years, we've had two signs up at the border. One says no trespassing, and the other one says help wanted. And we are responsible as a society for allowing our government to not enforce its laws for the last 26 years, and that breeds disrespect for the rule of law. So we have a right to expect our government to enforce the law and to have laws that the public will support enforcing. And at the same time, I had a Republican congressman who's a well-known conservative and anti-comprehensive immigration reform person say to me, he said, it's immoral not to enforce the law. And I said, well, that's true, but it's also immoral to ignore the law for 26 years and then say, oh, now we're going to enforce the law and we're going to enforce it retroactively. I guess the example I use is, what if the government decided to send me a bill for every time I've broken the speed limit on the interstate the last 26 years? And they said, we didn't stop you, but we've been monitoring you by satellite on your GPS system, and here's a ticket for every time you broke the speed limit. And by the way, we're going to charge you for every time, and we're going to confiscate your car. Now, I don't think most Americans would think that's very fair. I wouldn't think it was very fair. I'd also be broke. So, I think that we have to understand that we bear some responsibility as a society for allowing folks to live among us for the last 26 years, benefiting from their labor. They've been allowed to plant their lives in this culture and in this country. And it's just not fair, it's not right to try to say to them, now, all of you go home. And so I think we have to make special accommodation for them. And so I've argued that once you secure the border, and then you have an opportunity for people to come forward to register, to undergo a criminal background check, to agree to learn to read, write, and speak English. And I do find that this is a key point. The fear in my community, at least, and I think it's true in most of the American communities, is they do not want a bilingual country. They do not want a World Series where you have to sing the Star Spangled Banner in Spanish and English the way you have to sing it in French and English when you go to Canada. They want this to be an English-speaking country. Now, I find among immigrant communities, particularly the Hispanic community, they don't have any argument with this. They want to learn English. They understand that the key to assimilation and to upward mobility is to learn to speak standard English. But we do have it on fairly good authority. David Cameron, Nicolas Sarkozy, and Angela Merkel in just the last month. Multiculturalism that involves multilingual stuff doesn't work. Then they have an opportunity to work their way toward full legal status. I personally believe that the only way you're going to secure the border is to turn off the magnet. As long as people can get jobs here, and obviously the 12 to 14 million that are here have gotten jobs here, or they wouldn't still be here, is to turn off the magnet. You got to find a way to enforce immigration law in the workplace. And I believe personally the only way to do that is to have a tamper-proof biometric identity card for everyone who's not a citizen, and give every American citizen a new version of their Social Security card that is tamper-proof with a thumbprint. That would cut down on identity theft, number one. The American people will not accept an identity card, but they already have Social Security cards. They're used to Social Security cards. When I go and preach for my best friend at Southwestern Seminary, in order for me to get an honorarium, I have to show him my Social Security card. We're used to that. And then you say to employers, if you employ somebody who doesn't have one of these two cards and we catch you, you're going to jail for a year. That'll turn the magnet off. And it'll turn off the exploiters who exploit illegal, undocumented workers. Let's understand there are powerful interests that want to keep things the way they are. And one of those interests is an unscrupulous section of the business community that profits significantly from undocumented labor. When I was working on a CFR, Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on Immigration Reform, we saw studies that show that the current status with the percentage of undocumented workers we have, probably suppresses wages for legal workers at the bottom of the wage scale by 10%. Now, 10% is a big percentage when you're dealing with people who are at the lowest margins of the income scale, and it would significantly improve the living standards of all those folks if we dealt with the undocumented labor issue so that people would be paid a more living wage. So you have to have and another thing I've discovered is, at least among evangelicals, it's important for them to put the human face on this, to understand that a significant number of these undocumented workers are evangelicals. Now, I'm told by the Hispanic Southern Baptist Caucus, we have about somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Hispanic Southern Baptists, that about 40% of those people are undocumented, which really shouldn't be surprising. I mean, you know, it's no secret that we evangelize. That's why we're called evangelicals. We share our faith. We believe it is an important part of our faith to share our faith. So Hispanics come to this country and they are looking for jobs, and we evangelize them, and they become Baptists. You can't drive from here to the Pacific Ocean on Route 66 or any interstate highway system. In every town you come to, there's going to be a First Baptist church, and attached to it's going to be an Iglesia Bautista. And so what I've said to pastors, and I've issued a challenge to them: take your local Spanish mission pastor out to lunch and let him explain the immigration issue to you. And it's had some significant results. I can think of at least 2 places where the pastors have done that, and they formed a coalition and stopped Arizona-type laws in their state. In 2 places in Texas where there were state legislators who were trying to propose Arizona-type laws, and their pastors, who were Southern Baptists, after having some dialogue with Hispanic Southern Baptist pastors, formed a coalition that helped to defeat the bills they were trying to introduce into the state legislature. When they understand this and they put a human face on it, it helps a great deal to bring it from an abstract issue to a concrete issue. And I would encourage that one of the things the religious community hasn't done that it should do more of is put a human face on this. Actual people. And talk about, you know, now I'm just going to be personal here. I was physically nauseated. I vomited. I was so upset when I first saw the footage of Elian Gonzalez being forcibly taken from his relative's home in Florida and returned to Cuba. There are hundreds of thousands of Elian Gonzalez's that would be played out if we tried to forcibly deport those who are here in an undocumented status. And the American people, fortunately, don't have the stomach for that kind of human tragedy played out on a massive scale.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for having me. I just wanted to ask Dan up front. I've never heard the denomination unaffiliated, but they do a really good job. Yes. I just wanted to talk today about several issues about the church's involvement in immigration and immigration reform. First of all, why we're involved, because a lot of people at first blush don't understand why the church would have an interest in this, especially Catholics. What it is we bring to the debate and what contributions we can make to the debate, what we think the moral issue is here overall, and what the solution is, and then talk a little bit about some of the successes and failures and best practices and lessons we've learned over the last, at least the last 10 years that I've been here. First of all, why is the church involved? There are 3 main reasons why we're involved. First of all, I call it an institutional issue, and what do I mean by that? Immigrants are us in a large way. We have grown parallel with the nation over the last 200 and some odd years, in some part because of immigration. And during the original colonies in 1776, we were 1% of the population. Now we're 25% of the population. And that's not just because we're fertile, it's also because of the waves of immigrants that have been coming throughout the years. European, East European, former Soviet Union, Asia, and Latin America. So it's part of our identity, it's part of who we are. And this plays out today in all our programs, in our parishes, in our social service programs, in our hospitals, and in our schools, where we have immigrants who are in these institutions or in our programs, and some are undocumented. In fact, we'll have some come to us or their family members saying, how can you help us? We're divided, my husband's out of status, and we can't really unless we change the law. So it's part institutional. Secondly, it's because of our teaching. The Gospels, both the Old and New Testament, are full of themes of migration. Jesus himself was an itinerant preacher. He taught us to welcome the stranger. And the popes over the last century have taught about this and written about it. You could have a whole course for a semester talking about this issue, but it's part of our teaching. And lastly, is because it's a humanitarian issue and it has moral implications. And a lot of times that's missed in the debate. We hear about the economics, we hear about the culture, we hear about the social consequences, we hear about the rule of law, but we don't hear about the fact this is about human beings. So faith groups such as ours and others are obligated to at least point out that there are moral issues involved in this debate. What do we bring? What uniquely can we bring to the debate, and what we try to bring to the debate? We are a humanitarian voice. I mean, we try to represent those who aren't part of the debate. There aren't many undocumented persons that are up on Capitol Hill talking about their stories. Now, the DREAM students are very brave, and they have done that, and I applaud them for that. But in a lot of cases, it's up to faith groups and immigrant rights groups to really sort of frame the issue from their perspective, because there's always two sides of the story. So we've tried to play that role. We've tried to play the role of negating other groups who are opposing immigration reform and trying to at least make the discourse civil. We also bring years of integration experience. I mean, immigrants go first to families and friends, but they go second to the local church, whatever denomination that is, because they feel community, they're able to connect with those who are from their country of origin. They're able even to communicate with their country of origin through the local church. So we bring that experience as well. And one thing that hasn't really been talked about a lot in this debate is we bring global experience. We're a global church, so it's not, we don't just take the perspective from the U.S. side. We take the perspective from all sides. The Holy Father has spoken about this on many occasions, not just on the U.S. debate, but on migration generally across the world. So we look at all sides of the issue. And finally, we have a constituency. Now, again, the constituency doesn't necessarily agree with us all the time, as the presentation shown. But if we do things better in the future, we might be able to capture more of that constituency to support changes in the program. What do we think the problem is here with this system? What's the moral issue that we see? Now, there are lots of issues, and this debate gets really emotional over who did what and when they did it and what's right and what's wrong. From the church perspective, we look at it from a global perspective. That, if the world was a chessboard, the sovereigns would be the kings and the migrants would be the pawns. So we have a system where the pawns are used regularly by the sovereigns and are used to advance their interests, and the pawns are easily discarded when it's in the interest of the sovereign. So take the U.S.-Mexico example, for example. From our perspective, the United States benefits from the labor of a large number of undocumented persons, but it has no obligation to protect them in the laws, and is able to receive their sweat equity, receive their taxes, and scapegoat them when it's convenient during a down economy, etc. Sending countries are also responsible. Some of the sending countries, Mexico, for example, de facto is go north and send us the remittances back. It's the third source of currency for Mexico. Do they have an obligation to try to look at policies to create jobs for people to stay where they are and live in dignity? I think so. And that's one of the things that the church thinks is the solution to the problem. Of course, we support comprehensive immigration reform. We've been promoting that for several years now. We think it's the right solution for a broken system. Bring people out of the shadows. Let them contribute. Let them be part of the society. It helps on the security front, and especially it helps keep families together and protects them from raids. We also believe there should be a future flow system. Now, this has not always been the case. In the past, we've really had a dubious view of guest worker programs, but the bishops decided a few years ago that we already have a big guest worker program. It's called 11 million undocumented people that have no rights. So we see a system where you have a legal flow going into a legal system. You have the E-Verify, you can implement the E-Verify so that everyone is in the legal flow. If you implement an E-Verify system without legalizing people, it's not going to work, because you're going to have people living off the books and creating an underground economy. We also believe families need to be kept together is the most important thing, and we need to keep family unification as a cornerstone of our system. And lastly, and this is an issue that hasn't really been debated much, is we need to look at root causes. I mean, why are people coming? What can we do to allow them to live where they are? From the Catholic perspective, migration should be driven by choice and not necessity. But again, it goes to a bit of the hypocrisy in the debate. I was in a meeting once with a lot of business people and a government official, and I said, oh, we need to look at the root causes here, because that will really, humanely stop the flow from coming. And someone said, well, where are we going to get our workers? From the church perspective, that's our answer to a border wall. But we believe that the debate and the system is characterized by, really, if it's broke, don't fix it. And where do you create the incentive to really fix the system? That's where they're stalemated right now. What are some of the things we've done successfully, and what are the things we need to do better? I mean, I think we've done a fairly good job of injecting some humanitarian sense to this debate. Without the faith groups speaking out, I think it would be a free-for-all. It would be open season. Now, the rhetoric is bad enough as it is, but at least the faith groups are a counter to the bad rhetoric that's often used in this debate, and I think we've had an impact there. We've also prevented some harsher measures from being enacted. Those of you who followed the debate over the last several years might have remembered the Sensenbrenner bill. That was a bill that would have done a lot of things, including criminalize those who assist undocumented, including clergy. We were able to beat that back with a proactive strategy in the Senate. Although the DREAM Act failed, I think we're making progress on that. I think we won the messaging battle. We just didn't get to 60 votes last time. So I think we're making progress. I just think we need to keep working at it. What have we not done well? Well, the statistics show we have to convince more Catholics of our position, particularly white Catholics. And I think we need to address the rule of law in a more effective way. And a lot of times our opponents, especially those who attack the church, claim that we're open borders, etc. And that's certainly not the case. It's certainly not church teaching. But we need to do a better job of reaching into the organizations that are comprised of white Catholics and parishes of white Catholics and say, look, this is the best way to restore the rule of law, because now we've got chaos. It's not based on legality, it's based on illegality. And all we do is throw resources at the border, and we do other enforcement things, and it's like a car breaking down, and you keep kicking the tire, the car's not going to start again. You gotta look at the whole system, and I think if we educate better, I think that we'll be able to sway public opinion in a favorable way. Finally, what about the future? What are we going to do for the future? We're in this to stay. As I said, it's part of our identity, it's part of our institutional interest, and we're just going to have to redouble our efforts on a lot of different things. One thing that we also need to put front and center is our efforts on integration, because I think one of the big issues in 2007 and ongoing which wasn't reported, is the cultural fear that is out there. It's not so much about the jobs, that's an issue. It's not so much about well, economics and jobs and rule of law, which is an issue, but it's also about people fearing that the nation's changing. Who are all these newcomers? We're gonna, one for English, two for Spanish. It's a sleeper issue, and I think the churches and the faith groups have the ability to address that issue and talk. These are our brothers and sisters. They're all one family under God here. They all have the same values that we have. Even in some cases, we can learn a lot from them. And they all want to be Americans. Now, come on. Learning English, paying a fine, waiting in line for 8 years before you can apply for citizenship. I think I would want someone who does that to be an American because they really want to be an American. So we need to do a better job of talking about people as sharing our same values, being who we are, part of the American dream. And I think if we keep doing that, I think eventually we'll win this. This is a long-term struggle. When I started this job, I thought, oh boy, we'll get this in the next few years, and that'll be great. I'll move on to something else. And now I'm like, okay, this is going to take a little bit longer than I thought. But I think eventually the Congress will decide that they have to do something. And the only way that they can do it is that they do it in a comprehensive way, and we're looking forward to that day.
Hi, first I wanted to thank Susan and Georgetown for inviting me and for hosting this panel, and thank Daniel for your research. We didn't make it onto the chart, but there has been some polling of the Jewish community, and we're similar to the general community. We are a bit more supportive, percentage-wise. I think because of the Catholic community, we share that history of migration. And I also want to thank Richard and Kevin for being such effective and strong advocates for their respective communities, because it's made a huge difference in this debate, so thank you. I just want to say a little bit about HIAS. It may not be so obvious who we are, and we are the migration and refugee arm of the organized Jewish community. We've been around for 130 years. We're actually the oldest refugee and migration agency in the country. We have been operating since 1881. We have assisted over 4 million migrants, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And I just wanted to point out also the evangelical, Catholic, and Jewish communities are all engaged in resettling refugees in this country. That's also a religious effort for the most part, and I think that speaks a lot to where we're coming from and our shared values of immigration and welcoming the stranger. I'm not going to talk very much about what we're trying to achieve, because it's not any different from what's already been discussed. It's not rocket science, as Richard said. It's all the pieces are out there. It's, I think especially in Washington, even though you hear different things coming out of policymakers' mouths, I think most people understand the key components of this and don't differ that much about it. The only issue I might have is to be more clear about what it means to secure the border first. But apart from that, I think we're all in agreement for what this policy needs to look like. So one of the questions I was asked to answer is why does the Jewish community engage in the immigration policy reform debate? There are not a lot of Jewish migrants these days. That's a good thing for us in a way, because most of our migration here was because we fled countries where we were persecuted or had no economic opportunities or were discriminated against, and that fortunately seems to be less of a problem for us around the world, although not, in some places we still do have that problem, and we're keeping a close eye on what might be going on now with increasing anti-Semitism around the world. But we don't help immigrants now because they are Jewish. We help them because we are Jewish, and we share the same basic foundation. We use the same Bible, at least half of it. There are 36 references to in the Hebrew Bible on welcoming the stranger. So it's actually the most often stated commandment in the Old Testament is the idea of welcoming the stranger. So obviously we share the same moral and religious values of everyone else at this table, and possibly probably around this room. It's a very common tenet of all faiths. We also see that our traditional commitment to the stranger is reinforced by the realities of our history, as I just described. We're a people on the move. This country has been extremely good to us. We recognize that. We think we have an obligation to keep those doors open for others who are coming to contribute their talents to this country, to seek opportunities. So that's one reason why we continue to do this work. And we don't feel that just because it may not be our families that are in need in our communities. If there are other families in this country and other communities that need help, we need to work together to address those concerns. We're part of the American fabric, so it's a shared responsibility of all of us. Also, just to be blunt, we're a very small community, so it's very important for us to establish ties with other communities, with Latino communities, new immigrant communities. So so their concerns are ours. So we really try to make sure that our voice is heard in this debate. Then the next question I was supposed to answer is, how has the Jewish community engaged in the immigration reform policy debate? So I actually saw this a little differently. I actually got kind of technical about our tactics. What are we doing? And so the Jewish community is very, it's not centralized. We've got a lot of different organizations doing work on this, from the American Jewish Committee, from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is very concerned about hate speech and hate activity, so obviously that's of a concern with immigrant groups. Our Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is our policy, kind of the Jewish community's policy arm, which is very concerned about issues of poverty, inequality, again, natural fit with immigration. There are the Jewish Federation system. Again, these are communities that are welcoming immigrants, that are very diverse, and they are also very engaged at a local level on welcoming immigrants. Our refugee resettlement work, which I talked about. And there are a lot of local organizations and communities that have high numbers of immigrants that really want to do something to make life fair for them. Jewish Community Action in Minnesota, Jewish Council for Urban Affairs in Chicago. These are groups that have come together to fight for justice for immigrants in their communities. These are people who are getting arrested, sitting down in front of detention centers. I mean, they're really passionate about these issues, and we try to support their work as much as we can. HIAS, along with some partners and local communities, launched the We Were Strangers Too campaign. We actually launched the Progress by Pesach. Pesach is Passover campaign in 2009, but we didn't actually get much progress by then, so we decided to shift and change the name and not put a deadline on progress. So we are now engaged in the We Were Strangers Too campaign, which is a campaign of Jewish activists all over the country and organizations. Most of the major Jewish organizations are members, and all of the Jewish denominations are members of this, fighting for humane and fair immigration reform, as was described by my colleagues. And also I wanted to talk about the Interfaith Immigration Coalition, which World Relief and Kevin's and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and HIAS and other Jewish groups and a wide range of groups are involved in. Muslim groups. We have a huge array of groups from all over the spectrum. I'm trying to look at some of these. The Episcopal Church, the Friends Committee, the Islamic Information Center, the Irish Apostolate, Jesuit Refugee Service, and we really have the United Sikhs, broad range of groups that have joined together to work together to try to coordinate some of the work that we're doing with our own communities so that we're effective and we can provide local communities with talking points, information, strategizing, and what they might need to become engaged in this debate. Because, these are the people who really care about this, and we want to make sure that they have what they need to be effective lobbyists. And other things we're doing, and I think this gets a little bit more about to the presentation and what we can do to change things in our communities. We are constantly going to talk, give presentations in synagogues, sermons, Devar Torah, which are the commentary on the Torah portion for the week. We try to write those that are related to immigration so rabbis can give them and just talk about immigration from the pulpit. We've done special Haggadahs, which is the guide to Passover on immigration that people can use. Sukkahs, our harvest festival, Sukkot, people build shacks in their backyard to celebrate the harvest and decorate them. We've done posters that kind of make the connection to immigration. We're trying to think of creative ways just so people get it in their minds and make the connection between our history and our faith and what's going on today for immigrants. We also have made a really strong effort to engage young people on this issue. I don't know if there was any polling done by age. I think there might have been on the DREAM Act, where you saw that the younger people are much more open and welcoming and kind of accepting, I think, of difference. So we really tried to engage them. We set up I have a DVD called Welcome the Stranger, which is a really fun interactive program that kids are bringing back to their college campuses, or they're just whatever in their local communities, and just to tie our history of immigration with what's going on today. And then we've done, again, in coordination with the Interfaith Immigration Coalition and USCCB and World Relief, just a broad range of political activity, press conferences, prayer vigils, rallies. There was a big rally back in March of 2010. There was a strong faith-based presence there. The Jewish community had T-shirts, and they said, it had the Jewish Campaign for Immigration Reform on the back. It said, my parents came from, and then you could write on the back. And we got so much attention from Latino immigrants who are just so thankful to see that, it's not just recent immigrants that care about this, that the American community does care about this. We've done call-in days, we've trained faith leaders on communications techniques, done roundtables. we were joking the other day, the only thing we haven't done is a 5K, so we're really having to think of new things to do. So how would you, the other question that we were told to answer is, how would you gauge the success or failure of immigration reform advocacy on the part of religious communities? And then it says what best explains different outcomes, which I can't really answer. But here are some of the challenges, and I think they're underscored by the data. Not everyone in our community buys in. Not everyone understands, not everyone believes in it. It's not a priority issue necessarily. And the second and related problem is that policymakers know that. Or at least they think they know that. And I was it was very encouraging to see that actually this may not be true, but it's certainly the perception. So that when Kevin and I or Richard go to talk to policymakers, they say, yeah, that's what you believe, but is that what everybody else believes behind you?
The media says the same thing.
Right. So that may be just a perception, but it's a perception that obviously holds us back from reform. We also know that in some, and this also, again, I'm so thankful to have that presentation about the polling. Some leaders in some communities are very active. Some religious leaders are very engaged in this and talk about it, at the pulpit. And others believe in it, but don't talk about it. So we need to maybe make more of an effort to do that. And also, I think a big challenge is that when there are so many issues confronting Americans, it's hard to get their attention on this issue. This is something that directly affects all of us for a broad range of reasons, whether it's, do people want to live in a world where so many people are living in fear in our country? Every day people are thinking that their parents are going to get deported. They don't, they go to work, they don't know if their kids are going to get home from school because there might be a raid where they're working. It's just this culture of fear that I think it does affect us, because is that a country is that how we want to live in this country? And then there's also the broader, economic benefits of immigration, the diversity and new ideas and hard work they bring. Again, people don't see that direct connection to their lives as easily as they do see the direct connection of other policies. And then in terms of successes, I think we've been really good in the last few years. Kevin, tell me if you think you agree, but we've built really strong coalitions. We had nothing just maybe 4 or 5 years ago. There's been a lot more new voices that have spoken out on this. We're becoming much more organized at the national and local level. And I think there's a real recognition that we're never going to succeed if we don't all work together and coordinate. So that's been a success. And I think, at least among the faith groups, there's an increased understanding that this is a core moral issue. And it's what we've got going for us is it's supported by nearly or all faiths. This is not something that there's disagreement about from a moral perspective. And then the last question I was told to address was, how do you see the future of such policy advocacy, and what should religious communities do differently going forward? Kevin kind of ended on this note, but building a movement takes time. I think we thought that this would go a lot faster than it has been. This is a civil rights issue. It's probably the civil rights issue of our age, and we have to take the long view. I know that Senator Kennedy said something, along those lines when the bill was defeated, I think in 2007 or 6. He seemed very calm. He was upset, but he said, you know what? These things take time, and we'll just have to keep fighting. So that's what we've been doing over the last 5 years. Again, I think it needs to be more of a central issue for clergy. And then people who care about this need to communicate with their clergy about how important this is so that it can become more of an issue in their community. I don't think we have enough resources to really organize and plan effective strategies for engaging local religious communities. I think more resources would be good. We are pretty good now at reaching and organizing people who already care, But our next step really needs to be, and this is again echoing what's been said, to bring in those for whom this is not a priority issue, but just really need to be educated and given the tools to engage. Finally, well, two more things. One is that immigration reform needs to be described and understood as an American issue. This is not a Latino issue. This affects all of us. And the faith community, as Kevin said, can be easily reached. I mean, this is a community that can, people come and join their families and they go to church. I mean, these are people that we can really access, people that are engaged and may care about this issue and may be moved to actually engage on it. And then I think the last thing is that we need to explore new messages that resonate with faith communities, and I think that was borne out by the polling as well. We've always talked about welcoming the stranger and the moral arguments, and of course we need to continue to do that because that's what we're about. But it's not enough. I mean, the economic arguments, the security arguments, the things, all of these, the top tier arguments that seem to sway people, we need to tap into that as well. We can't just go out and talk to people about this as a moral issue because that's not going to change their minds. And we need to effectively go out and not be afraid to talk about this as an issue that's really important to U.S. security and economic prosperity. So I think we need to be doing more of that as well. But I am hopeful, but again, it's going to take a while and we really need to build a movement.
Thank you all for the comments. Let me begin the questioning, and then we'll open it up for the audience. I was struck, particularly after hearing about the polling results, that all of you did talk about issues with regard to public education and information. I have a polling result that makes it even more extreme. The German Marshall Fund has been doing an 8-country study of public opinion on immigration. And we've always asked, I'm on the advisory group, and we've always asked questions about, do you think there are too many, just the right number, or too few immigrants? And I've always wondered, well, what do people have in their back of their minds when they say too many? So we asked, starting last year, what percent of your country's population are immigrants? And the percentage, the average response in the United States was 39%. The real number is about 13 or 14%. And so then we told half of the group that was being surveyed, as you may know, 14% of the American population are immigrants. Do you think it's too many, et cetera? And it totally changed the results. A lot more people said that it was too few once they actually knew what the proportions were. So the question I'd like to pose is, and it follows up on Melanie's presentation, but what are the strategies, what are the ways in which the religious community can, or the leaders within the faith community can better inform the public? And speaking, coming out of the university, how can we help you? Because places like Georgetown certainly have a great deal of interest from the whole, from all of the same reasons that you've given, as well as our underlying assumptions with regard to social justice issues, to set the record straight and try to make this a more informed discussion. So this can get some more of your insights about what you can be doing and then how we can be helping.
I think the more information, the more facts we can get out, the better it is. And we do need to talk about, I have found that you seldom go wrong by appealing to people's enlightened self-interest. And it is in our enlightened self-interest as Americans to have a steady immigrant flow into the United States. Particularly, there's a Council on Foreign Relations task force that I was privileged to work on that did a report that I would encourage all of you to read if you haven't read it. Talks about this as a security issue, and not just in terms of people coming in, but the country that's going to lead the world in the 21st century is going to be the country that can attract the most brain power from whatever birth origin it comes from to the same places. Now, we start off with an advantage because we are a country of immigrants. All of us, our forefathers and ancestors came here from somewhere. Unless we're Native Americans, we all came either early or late. We are the children of our grandchildren of immigrants. In fact, I saw one of the things that I discovered during this research on the CFR report was that a significant majority of Americans now trace their ancestry to people who came in through Ellis Island. They have now, there are more people who came in from Ellis Island than people who came before Ellis Island, which was a surprise to me. I guess that may be partially because of where I live. But I think that when we can help people to understand that this is an issue, that immigration, legal immigration, a pathway to legal immigration is a benefit to the United States. It's a benefit economically, it's a benefit socially. I mean, I lived in England for 2 years, 11 months, and 4 days, not that I was counting. And let's face it, 90% of the world would love to live in the United Kingdom. And I hope I don't hurt the feelings of any English folks that are here, but it is an incredibly boring place to live compared to the United States of America. And the reason is because of all of the immigrant contributions to our culture that England does not have in terms of our language and jazz, our cuisine. Everything about America is a much more multifaceted, varied tapestry than is the case in the United Kingdom. And it's because of all of the immigrants that have come to our shores that we have been tremendous beneficiaries. And, you know, the unique thing about us, anybody can become an American in a way that you can't become German or English. Wherever you're from, if you come and you pledge allegiance to a certain set of secular ideals embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you can become an American. So that gives us a tremendous advantage in this race for leadership in the 21st century, but it's going to have profound effects on security, on economic leadership in the 21st century, and we need to get this right. And the American people need to understand we need to get it right. Also, I do think that we need to help Americans understand what I think they are beginning to intuit. And that is that this issue has reached critical mass. It has reached the place now where it is rending the social fabric of the nation in ways that are far easier to rend than they are to mend. And if we don't deal with this issue successfully soon, it'll be more difficult and more painful to deal with it later. So I would say any information you can get out there by any method, you know, the media can be a real problem. I mean, media, they say to me all the time, well, we know this is what you believe, but is this what Southern Baptists believe? And my response is, okay, first of all, who knows more Southern Baptists? You or me? Secondly, I'm elected by Southern Baptists. I mean, the trustees that I work for are elected by the Southern Baptist Convention membership. If they didn't agree with what I was doing, I wouldn't have my job. Thirdly, I said, you know, let's test it. I'm going to go to Orlando to our national convention where we have thousands of elected messengers from our local churches, and I'm going to lay out a program for comprehensive immigration reform, and we'll see what happens. Will they stone me with hymnals or will they applaud? Well, I got sustained applause. Now, it is interesting that there is a generational issue, and the older folks are less flexible on this issue than middle-aged folks, and middle-aged folks are less flexible than younger folks. But you know, the good thing about that is we're getting more younger folks and more middle-aged folks and fewer old folks with every passing year.
Just some quick points. One thing that I forgot to mention is we have to put all this in context. I go back to 2001 to mark the beginning of this round of immigration reform debate. And as many of you may recall, Vicente Fox gave a joint address to Congress the Thursday before 9/11. And there was a lot of excitement that they'd pass the immigration reform bill, and then 9/11 happened. So we had to deal with the security issues for several years. And now, and I was struck by the polls that Dan gave, we're in a recession. I mean, I'm surprised that it's as positive as it is, considering that we have almost 10% unemployment. So we have to take that into account in terms of what the views are out there. And some of that is a reaction to some of these events that have happened. What do we need to do better? We need to educate our priests better in preaching about this. We've found over time that some priests disagree with us on this. They're just like anyone else. That doesn't mean they have to give a homily every Sunday, but at least they need to know about the issue and how it impacts the church. And we need to break into the parishes more than we have. And in terms of the universities, I mean, you're doing a great job as it is, but I think the key to this over the next 50 years is the young people. And I think actually they're more amenable to immigrants and to immigration reform than older Americans are. And I think we saw that in the DREAM Act, but I think there's such potential there for education and for educating future leaders on this. I mean, this isn't going to be solved with an immigration reform bill. That's not going to be a magic bullet. This is going to continue and will continue throughout our history. So to educate students on this issue is really vital.
I don't really have too much to add, but I do have a question, and that is, taking advantage of all you people being here. I think that, as the polls show, and I think what we're seeing, we can make a lot of progress in our communities on this if we take the time to educate and explain and connect them with people who are going through, the immigration system, and so that put a human face on it, if they don't have that already. But how do we get policymakers to shift, because it's become such a political issue? What do we do about making the political reality, a place where we can get some reform done? That's my big question. I mean, it's going to take a long time to, like I said, build a movement. In the meantime, is there anything we can do, Kevin or Richard, to influence decision makers on this? Because it's the debate, quite frankly, is ugly on the Hill.
It is. There's no question about that. I've heard things on the Hill that shock me. I think what we have to do is we have to educate them about where their constituencies are, and perhaps change some faces. I mean, 25% of the U.S. House are new. Elections have consequences. 1 out of every 4 House members is a freshman. That's huge, and it's the change in party affiliation of 63 is the largest in a presidential off year since 1938, and I think you're going to see as big a turnover next year in 2012. There are going to be a lot of incumbents that are going to lose their jobs. I mean, the American people are fed up with not having representatives that respond to them. And they're going to elect people who will. And I think that what we need to do is encourage them to understand that, and also be encouraging people to not just complain, but do something about it, and that is run for office. I've met with the new Republican members, and they're an astonishingly different group. Very few of them are politicians. Very few of them are people who are in the state legislature, for instance. I mean, they're doctors, they're nurses, they're pig farmers, they're real estate agents. They're people that have not been involved in politics. And the system works. I mean, if we get involved in the system works. Ultimately, you have the kind of government you put up with. And I think we've put up with less than we deserved for a while. And that's in both parties. I think that, I'll say it again, I think that the American people are ahead of where their representatives are on this issue. And part of that may be that, you know, the Congress and the Senate in particular are older as a demographic average than the population of the country is. But I think we need, you know, this kind of polling data helps, but, you know, people, when they go back to their districts, they need to hear from their people what they really think about this issue. And, you know, they're gonna hear different things in different parts of the country. I mean, it is interesting that you do tend to get different kinds of answers from people who live in different parts of the country. And I find that the people who come from the parts of the country that have the most immigrants are the most receptive, and the ones who come from the parts of the country that are the most stable populations and have fewer immigrants are least receptive.
Okay, why don't we open it up? And please introduce yourself when you're asking a question or making a comment.
Don Kerwin from Migration Policy Institute. I have kind of a two-part question. I understand that Congressman Sensenbrenner actually did some of the early polling on messaging, and he found that word amnesty was absolutely anathema. I mean, if you were to describe a public policy proposal as amnesty, you know, the support for it went way down. And the first part of my question is this: why did the religious community, when I think back on it, run away from that amnesty word, you know? I mean, forgiveness is not assuming that people need it, is not a dirty word or a dirty theme in kind of religion. I mean, we're all beneficiaries of a great amnesty. We believe that, you know? And the second part is this, and I'd love to be wrong about this, Daniel and everybody, but I gotta say, I'm a bit suspicious about the polling. You know, I really am. I think that, you know, if you can explain comprehensive immigration reform, and if you have the time to define it, then yeah, you have the majority of the people on your side. But it doesn't work out that way in the public debate very often, you know? In other words, the terms of the debate, the kinds of questions change almost instantly. And they use words like, you know, amnesty and you know, change the frame of reference. I mean, they're quite good at that. So I just wonder if you'd respond to that.
Well, I think, first of all, I object to the term amnesty because and I think a lot of Americans do, because it basically breeds disrespect for the rule of law. If you have the rule of law, if you've broken the law, you need to pay a price for having broken the law. Now, I don't think the price should be deportation. But I think that, you know, for instance, I can just tell you among my constituency, if you were to say we're going to have an amnesty, and, you know, no penalties, no fines, no requirement that you register and undergo a criminal background check. What Reagan did last time. What Reagan did was an amnesty. What Jimmy Carter did with those who went to Canada during the Vietnam War to avoid service, that was amnesty. They got to come home with no fine, no probation, no anything. Now, let me be clear, I would let them come home. But I would have required they spend 2 years working in veterans hospitals at minimum wage, taking care of the guys who took their place. The point I'm making is, yes, they broke the law. Now, there is a distinction. Most of our homegrown lawbreakers break the law so they don't have to work. These folks broke the law in order to work. But they did break the law, and they need to pay a penalty. But I think that undergoing a criminal background check, paying the fines, going through a probationary status, as he said, you know, people who are willing to do that and want to be Americans, they want to be Americans badly, and we ought to let them be. I think there's enough respect for the rule of law that's why the other side uses amnesty, because it implies a pardon. And that breeds disrespect for the rule of law. And I do think that we as Americans tend to take the rule of law for granted because it's almost always been part of the furniture in the room. But, you know, let's be very honest here, folks. There are very few places in the world, and I'm including the European Economic Community, where the Bush-Gore election would have been decided as peaceably as it was in the United States. Polls show that about 25% of the people think that Al Gore won that election. Now, I disagree with it, but about 25% of the American people think he won. But when the Supreme Court said that it was over, the American people accepted that it was over. That's a very precious and a very fragile thing. And I think that we need to do everything we can to nurture the rule of law and respect for the rule of law. And I think a blanket amnesty doesn't do that. And I think that you do get a little, I think you get a little more pro immigration reform polling than you would in reality, because some people at least feel ashamed of not being more pro-immigration reform than they are, which is a good sign. But I'm still convinced that there's a critical mass of Americans, more than a simple majority, that are ready for the kind of comprehensive immigration reform that we've talked about. Now, you know, when I say secure the border first, I'm not talking about building fences. I'm saying the identity card. You pass the rule. I think you're going to have to do comprehensive. McCain and Bush both said this to me personally. We tried to do it simultaneously. It can't be done simultaneously. There's not the trust. There's not the trust. The American people don't trust their government to do what they say they're going to do. So you're going to have to do it sequentially, but you can do the bill simultaneously, but it is implemented sequentially. And I think you secure the workplace. That's how you secure the border. The identity card and the tamper-proof Social Security card secures the border by securing the workplace. And then you have the amnesty period, or the period to come forward for probationary status.
Just two quick points. Do you want to? Just on the amnesty word, to be honest, we did some focus groups and it didn't work, and earned citizenship worked. So instead of putting our energy into a debate over whether amnesty is a dirty word or not, we decided to use the word that worked, or works better, let's say, than amnesty. You can debate whether you want to get into a debate with Sensenbrenner over the meaning of amnesty, and I think that's a loser overall. It doesn't help your cause. The polling, you need to add another question. Would you pick up the phone and call your legislator? I think that's what that's why it's so hard, because a lot of people don't self-identify in terms of how does it impact my life every day. Is this a priority for me? As Melanie mentioned, it's way down the list. I'm not going to spend my capital or my time talking to my congressman about this. I'll support what they do, but I think that's the big issue going forward, getting people to do something.
I know Daniel wanted to say something. This will be really quick. So from the progressive side of the perspective of the spectrum, we had talked about in the Interfaith Immigration Coalition this idea of a forgiveness. It's at our roots, and why not just call it like a forgiveness campaign, and there was a lot of resistance to that, and I think what we saw, some of the resistance was valid, because later when you saw some of the discussions with Schumer and Graham last year, there was this idea that undocumented immigrants would have to plead guilty to something, and there was a lot of concern about that. I think that a service component might be an interesting part of immigration reform, but I think admitting guilt, that just doesn't sit well with a lot of the faith communities that feel like these are people who just came to work and improve their lives, and they shouldn't have to beg for forgiveness. But so from that side of the perspective, there was a lot of hesitance about embracing that.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion about trying to quantify people's level of commitment when it comes to the issue of immigration, because as we showed with the data, only about 7% of Americans said it was the most important issue around the election. We actually found in our focus groups that, I remember one woman in particular, when talking about immigration versus an issue like abortion, she said, abortion's here, it's personal, it's in your face. Immigration's somewhere out there. And I think to a lot of people, the issue of immigration, they don't really see it in their everyday lives. They may see people who they think are immigrants, and they may have a general understanding that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants. But I think, by and large, it doesn't affect their everyday experience. So that's really important to understand. To address the issue about whether what you're seeing on the ground is similar to what you're seeing in the polling data. And I would say it probably has less to do with the research and more what's going on in public debate. In a focus group or in a survey, we can walk people through a policy. And I think people often aren't given that chance in a public debate. It's he said, she said, it's back and forth, it's words like amnesty, as opposed to people sort of slowly walking the public through a policy.
It's actually interesting, Richard, that the 1986 legalization, which also tried to very much avoid the term amnesty, included a 18-month temporary status, and before you could get full permanent status, you had to learn English. And it has a lot of the same, there were security checks and.
Except that they didn't do it.
No,
Most of them didn't do it. I mean, they didn't enforce it.
The regular legalization program, all of the studies showed it had very, very little fraud. The agricultural workers program, there was a different problem with that because it was serving a different issue, but.
I was talking more about the ones who
Yeah.
came after that.
Okay.
9 million came after that.
Okay, Charles Keeley, and then let's take a couple of things because I think we'll probably have to wrap up in the next 5-10 minutes. 2 seconds.
My name is Charles Keeley. I used to teach immigration here at Georgetown. One of the things that's different with this conversation from earlier conversations about the faith communities influencing immigration, I go back to the Immigration Act of 1965, is you're talking about much more of a retail politics. In those days, the faith communities and other allies basically said, what do we do in order to impact the votes in Congress? Not what public opinion was. So I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's different. The second thing is I didn't hear any of you talk about the coalitions to be made with business and labor or other groups. And in fact, labor was crucial in 65. Business was crucial in 86. And I suspect that, and this may be my bias because I'm an old guy talking about the past, if 95% of the people in this country believe that immigration reform was a good thing, that would not necessarily lead to the prediction that would pass Congress. It's a different issue, convincing the constituents and convincing Congress. But you need the votes in the House and the votes in the Senate and a president to sign it. If I could be maybe a little bit provocative, I don't care how much effort you put into public education. That's not where the game is at. Again, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying I think that's a fact. I'm not endorsing it.
Let me just see if there are any other questions before because this will be the wrap up as well. So if I'm not seeing any other hands, then.
I think that it is true that, first of all, there is a coalition to be had with the business community. The business community, the reputable part of the business community, they understand this issue. They want comprehensive immigration reform. They want a steady, stable labor supply, and they understand their need for it. Labor is more ambivalent, and for I don't know all the reasons, but they are more ambivalent. But I would suggest that this is a different country than it was in 1965 with a 24/7 news cycle, and I don't think Congress is as responsive as I'd like for it to be. But I think it's a lot more responsive than it was in 1965 to public polling and to their constituencies. Email, Lord have mercy. People who have jobs like the senators and the congressmen, people who have jobs like mine, it was a lot easier before email because they either had to take the effort to make a phone call or write you a letter. Now they can just send you an email. And I can tell you that the congressmen and the senators, they weigh their email, literally. They take all the yays and all the yays and nays, and they weigh them. They don't even bother to count them a lot because there are too many of them. But they know every day they've got their finger on what the percentage of response is, both in their constituent offices and in our offices. Yeah, there are exceptions. People who are here to do the right thing and are willing to lose their office if they need to but most of them are here. I'll accept this freshman class, which are different, but most of them I've run into, they love being a United States Senator, and they love being a U.S. Congressman. And their worst nightmare is to lose and have to go back and live in the place they represent. And most of them, when they lose, they don't go back home. They put their snout and both front trotters in the trough as lobbyists. And they're going to do whatever it is they think will help them stay here. I mean, that may be a cynical view, but it's born of 22 years of observation and experience.
Just a couple points. We do ally ourselves with business and with labor. Again, I think, and I'm sure if there are representatives here, they'll kick me later, but I think it's turned a matter of their priorities. I think, they have other things that they're working on. So is this their top priority? Are they going to count the votes? Are they going to put resources in this? That's the question. Is it high on their priority list? And one thing we haven't talked about, which is talked about a lot, is the Latino vote. And in terms of getting people to change their vote, I think we're starting to see that in the Senate, but it hasn't trickled down to House races yet. I mean, I think it's going to be a big issue in the presidential election. Senator Reid was reelected because of the immigration issue, in my opinion. Barbara Boxer was helped by it. Patty Murray was helped by it. Obama's going to be helped by it because he's got to win some of those states. So it's going to become more and more of an issue, and the more that there's harsh rhetoric used against certain ethnic groups that that voters in that ethnic group take to heart, the more that immigration is going to be a prominent issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I agree that I have a hard time seeing how you get the votes without educating and engaging the public, because obviously the goal is to get the votes, but, just thinking about during the DREAM debate with Claire McCaskill, and, all of the calls that she got from, people in her state who wanted her to vote for the DREAM Act, and how they actually, I mean, that was a very difficult vote for her, but without that kind of influence from her constituency, it would have been very easier to vote against, and she didn't. So I think it's just totally intertwined, and I don't see how you get the votes without getting people engaged.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists.